Hi, so today I'm going to be taking a look at the differences between a Trek Rail Generation 4 and the Gen 5. So on the left hand side I've got a 2024 Generation 4, and then on the right hand side I've got a 2025 Generation 5. As you can see, the Gen 4 has been upgraded a fair bit, and then the Gen 5 is in its stock configuration. What I'm going to do is just go over the bike and just look at the various changes that they've made to the actual frame and some updates that they've had. But the main things that they've changed is obviously the Gen 5 is now a mixed wheel bike, so it's 29er 27.5, and then the Gen 4 was a 29er 29er, and they've updated the motors, so the Gen 5 now has the new Bosch CX motor with the 800 watt hour battery, as opposed to the Gen 4 which had the 750 watt battery. But as I say, what I'm going to do is I'll start at the front of the bike and I'll just work through and show you all of the updates and changes that they've made. So let's start at the front of the Gen 4. Both bikes come stock with a 160mm fork. The Gen 4 can run a maximum of 170mm fork, and the Gen 5 can run a maximum of 180mm fork. This bike has been upgraded to a 170. On the Gen 4, it uses a 1.8 inch crown steerer, so it uses an oversized bearing at the bottom, which makes the head tube slightly more bulbous. The Gen 5 head tube is now a traditional 1.5, so it should be much easier to get hold of forks and bearings for this. The Gen 4 uses the knock block system. This is a steering lock system, stop your handlebars from rotating too much. It's integrated into the headset, the spacers and the stem. It's a slight inconvenience because if you want to run a standard stem, you need to get an additional piece to actually keep the system functioning. So you'd put this piece on the top of the headset, tighten it down, and then that keeps the steering lock functioning, and you can put standard spacers and the standard stem on. The Gen 5 has eliminated the knock block, so it just uses a standard headset, spacers and stem, so you can run any stem you like without having to buy any additional parts. It also has the benefit of the angle adjustment, so it comes with a standard 0° headset cup. You can buy an additional one which can be either plus or minus 1 degree, so that's a nice benefit if you want to slacken or steepen the bike up. The Gen 4 uses a system controller that's integrated into the top tube. This is okay, it's a big improvement on the previous Bosch systems, but I wish they'd done similar to Specialized and just put a little screen in there, because you really need to know what your battery percentage is, and these LEDs, although they give you a general indicator, it just would be nice to be able to just see exactly what your percentage is. The Gen 5 currently uses the same system controller as the Gen 4, although as you can see it's got a blanking plate here, so presumably there's going to be an upgradable display coming in the future. I mean, it's a little bit untidy this, I'm not sure if you can see here, but the system controller overlaps at the top there. It just looks a little bit unfinished, so hopefully the screen isn't too long away. This is the cable ports on the Gen 4. Now what you do is you just undo this torque bolt and then you just feed the cables in. They go directly into the frame and then sit on some clips just above the battery. I'll show you that once I take the battery out. But there isn't actually any tubing or any clamping surface on this, so when the cables are in, they can become a little bit rattly. So some people have been putting a little bit of additional housing or heat shrink over the cable to keep the cables from rattling. Here's the cable ports on the Gen 5, very similar setup. It's a Torx bolt, then you just feed your cable and hose in. But this frame actually has tubes which guide the hoses and cables, so it stops them from moving about. I'll show you that once I take the battery out. This is the key release for the battery. So you have to remember to keep hold of your key. You just push that in, rotate the key, battery will release. It has this little handle catch which you just push down and then the battery will remove. This is the battery release on the Gen 5. So as standard it just uses a 6mm Allen key, although you can have it swapped out for a key if that's what you want. So you just insert the 6mm, just twist, it releases the battery. You'll see there's a little silver button here. It's got a retaining mechanism. You just have to push that in and the battery will release. And then you just push it back up and it will hold it in place, so it's not just going to fall out. And then you just have to use a little bit of force to push it back to get it to click in, and then it will hold in place. There's an additional feature on this battery where you can run this set screw, so you can get that to focus for you, and this goes into this hole here and it uses a 4mm Allen key, and this adds some extra security to the battery. if you're not going to remove it or if you're going to be riding in rough terrain. The Gen 5 has 4 water bottle mounts. The top 2 are for connecting the range extender if you wish to run that. The Gen 5 has these additional accessory mounts underneath the top tube, so you can run a pump, CO2 or tools. Just wanted to quickly say about the insertion depth on the seat post. So I'll put on screen the insertion depths for the Gen 4. The seat post insertion depth has been increased on the Generation 5, so I'll put on screen what it is now. I believe on this frame it's 20mm increase, so that should help with longer dropper posts. The Gen 4 suspension is a 230 by 57.5, although most people tended to overstroke the shock to increase the travel. The Gen 5 suspension now uses a 205 by 65mm shock, so it's pretty easy to get hold of these. So here I have a Vivid coil, and it's a pretty standard size. The Gen 5 now has the ability to adjust the leverage curve. So what you do is you just swap this flip chip round from this position to this position, so it's more or less, and this will just increase the progression, so it makes it more suitable for a coil shock. So I believe in the stock configuration, the less it's 20% progression, and then in the more it's 25%. The Gen 5 retains the Mino Link feature from the Gen 4. So what this does is it's a flip chip, and you can adjust the bottom bracket height as well as the head angle. I believe it's by ½ a degree for the head angle, and I believe it's 10mm for the bottom bracket. Trek do an excellent guide which shows you all of the adjustments and how they affect the geometry of the bike. I'll leave a link to that in the description. Here's the charge jaw on the Gen 4. So you can see it's not very well sealed. It's also a little bit flimsy on this. These tend to break quite often, so most people generally just remove the battery to charge. Here's the battery cover door on the Gen 5. This enables compatibility with the range extender, so you can run the Bosch Powermore 250 if you want, because of the way that the door now opens. On the Gen 4, the linkage bearings are very close to the actual wheel, so on this it has a dirt skirt and a fender fitted, but I'll just remove these up so you can see how it actually is. But what tends to happen is mud collects here and it gets forced into these bearings, which causes them to wear out prematurely, hence why this has a fender and a dirt skirt fitted. So the main frame bearings have been moved further away from the wheel, so this should help with the water and mud ingress because the bearings are actually physically further away. So it should help with the lifespan of the bearings. Well, obviously you're going to get some mud in there, but it is helpful that it's moved further inward. This is a chainring on the Gen 4. It comes stock as a 34 tooth. I'm not sure what the officially supported chainring size is, but this is a 36 and it's had no problems running with a 36. So the Gen 5 comes stock with a 34 tooth chainring and it can run a maximum of 36. I wanted to bring to your attention the fact that the new Bosch motor is actually a narrower Q factor. So I believe the previous one was 175mm and the new one is about 168 from what I'm measuring. The main thing to note with that is that if you're going to be changing the chainring, you need to make sure that you get a compatible one. So what you need to get is one that's compatible with the DU38. Hopefully that's in focus for you. So I'm going to be swapping this one out for a 36 tooth. Here's the Chainstay Protector. This is just adhesive that holds it in place, so it's pretty easy to come off after a while, especially if you use a pressure washer or anything near it. But they're pretty cheap to replace. Here's the Chainstay Protector for the Gen 5. So as you can see, it's had a bit of a redesign compared to the previous version. So it's added these little mounds, which generally help with the chain noise, although they're not that squishy, so I'm not sure how much benefit they'll actually give. But I do like the fact that this is now a bit more coverage along the bottom as well. And I like the fact that it goes all the way up to the chain guide and is actually bolted onto the frame. So it's got 2 bolts here and then a third one back here, as well as having adhesive to help hold it in place. Here's the brake hose input for the Gen 4. You have to make sure that you have this additional loop for when the suspension is cycled, and sometimes this hose can catch on the spokes. On the Gen 5, where the brake hose comes out of the rear stay, it's got this additional piece here which helps hold the hose in place. Here's the cable routing on the Gen 4. I'm not sure if you can see that because it's pretty tight in here. But this is an absolute nightmare if you ever have to reroute these cables, because you have to get the brake hose with the speed sensor through this tiny little hole at the back. This one obviously has a blanking plug because it's running T-type, but if you were running your normal gear cable through there, you've got to make sure that they go in a particular order up over the motor. Normally you have to drop the motor out to get it in. Here's the cable routing of the Gen 5. So it's guided through the frame with the tubes, and then it pops out here at the bottom of the down tube. So you've got your brake hose, and then if you're running a gear cable, that would be coming out here. It's got a little blanking plug because I'm running the T-type. And then you've got the speed sensor and the T-type, which are both being run off the Bosch motor. And then you've got this little clamp to hold them in place that sits over the bearing. This is the cable routing just above the battery. You can see it flop about a little bit. What I find best is you can put a little cable tie at the top there just to hold the cables better in place. So here's the battery compartment when it's out. You can see the system controller cable is still just held in place with this little guide, but the dropper post, the shifter and the brake hose are actually guided via these tubes. So on the Gen 4, the previous generation of the Bosch motor mounted with these 3 bolts either side, and then these mount directly onto these plates, where you can see these little silver plates that are actually attached to the motor itself. They then have Torx bolts on them as well. The problem is that those can become loose and then they can cause the motor to move, which I have seen actually crack frames where there's been movement. So you have to make sure if you hear any sort of noise from around the motor, you've got to make sure all of the bolts are torqued correctly. The Gen 5 uses a 2-bolt or 2-axle mounting system. So you have one of them here and then one of them here. And this is a much nicer system because the motor actually bolts directly to the frame as opposed to having the plates on the previous generation. Here is the motor guard. Now obviously this has an additional rock stop rubber guard on, but the stock motor guard is metal. I'm not sure how well this will come out on camera, but this one is actually cracked, and they tend to crack around this section of the motor. It makes a very disturbing noise when it actually cracks. So I would say to invest in some sort of additional guard to cover the motor housing. The motor cover and skid plate is plastic on the new version. I'll just see if I can show you around. Still has holes for drainage. The brake mounts on the Gen 4, stock it'll take 180mm, although I'm using a 203 rotor here, so I've had to use an adapter. I'm not sure what the officially supported maximum size is, but I know you can run a 220 on these. Here's the brake mount on the Gen 5. Stock, it'll run a 200mm rotor. As you can see, it doesn't need any adapters. It can run a maximum of a 223mm rotor. It still has the compatibility with a kickstand. I'm not quite sure why Trek insist on putting this on rails. It doesn't seem like the appropriate bike for it, but it does have compatibility if you want to run a kickstand. So here's the 2 batteries. So you've got the 750 at the bottom here and the 800 at the top. So the 750 is quite a bit longer and the 800 is a little bit fatter. It's got a little bit more girth to it. So here's the 750. So this is the RIB or removable integrated battery system. This one comes with a little carry handle integrated into it. And then obviously you have to have the cover plate for it. I should see if I can show you this. Here's the actual charge port. It does have an indicator on the side here, and I assume the button is on the other side, but you can't get to it, so you can't check the battery without plugging it in. Here's the other side with the handle for carrying it. This is the RIB 2. You can see this is rubberized on the bottom section. I believe it's just adhesive that's holding it on. It comes with a little battery checker on it. Say, obviously, I think it's on the 750, but you can't get access to the button to press it. There it is, power tube 800. And then it's got the release mechanism and then the charge port. They both use the same charging connector. I wish Bosch would come out with a slightly better charging brick for this. It's pretty slow. I think it takes about 4 to 6 hours roughly to charge these. So it would be nice if they came out with a fast charger. They used to on their older generations, but they don't seem to have done it for the smart systems. Just going to do a quick check of the weight of these. So here's the 750. And here's the 800. That was a look at the differences between the Gen 4 and the Gen 5 of the Trek Rail. If you've got any questions, please feel free to leave a comment. And thanks for watching.